Shalom. Welcome. We are beginning to look a little deeper at unifying with the cycles of nature. We've now come to the fourth cycle, the winter cycle. If you've read the newsletter, you'll see that we're taking an overlook at all of the cycles of nature within the context of the year. We look at spring, it's a rebirth, and we have the opportunity to change. We sense it with all of our senses, and the intercourse we have with activity, with senses that are renewed in springtime. Same is true with our spiritual and emotional bodies. We have that opportunity for transformation. Then as we go into summer, all of that transformation blossoms, and we see the fruits of the change that has taken place. And then as we go into fall, we begin to bear those fruits, and we begin to take them within ourselves, and change comes to fruition. And then in the winter, we begin the digestion of all of that change. And there's more opportunity for transformation. From this higher state of consciousness that we've entered into, we now experience things differently. And as we experience things differently, we're able to change things like thoughts that are negative become positive, anger gets turned into grace. Sefer Yetzirah describes all these opportunities that we have for transformation. So what I'd like to look at now is how this happens. How does this take place for us spiritually and emotionally? We can see it taking place in the cycles of nature all around us. We see it in spring with the flowers beginning to come out of the earth, and then we watch them bloom, and then we reap the fruits of the flowers, and then we digest them. We see all that happening around us. But how does it really happen inside of us? In the newsletter, we began to talk about what the Sefer Yetzirah calls the 32 paths, the netivot in Hebrew. And these 32 paths are different for each individual. They're individual paths, but they're each an opportunity for higher states of consciousness. And when we start off on our quest, on our spiritual quest with meditation and whatever else we're doing, we see that maybe we're in the basement and we can see some light from the windows in the basement, but maybe we see the weeds. We have a certain viewpoint or a vantage point from that state of consciousness. But then as we transform and we're reborn into another state of consciousness, maybe the first floor, now we see things differently. There's windows, we can see beyond the weeds. And then there's the second floor and the third floor and the fourth floor, like that. All rebirths where our senses come alive and we begin a new transformation. I'd like to look more deeply at how that really happens. And I want to say from the start that there are two main things that we do from our side that allows that to happen. One is our regular practice of Hitboded meditation. Hitboded meditation is the mindless practice of meditation where we're in a complete state of surrender. We're taught by a UMI qualified teacher. And that meditation is crucial for this transformation. The second point is our intention, what's called in Hebrew kavanah. So you have to have an intention to make this transformation. What I'd like to look at as we look more deeply about what causes the transformation and what we need to change in our meditation and also in our will for the transformation to happen, I'd like to look at the Semitic tradition and some very special teachings from the Semitic tradition. Now, all the traditions have stories that help us understand what needs to change and how we need to behave and how we need to meditate and things like that. But I'm going to use our tradition. I'm going to use a story from the Torah that's typically described as Jacob's journey. And I'm going to read a section of it. It's Genesis 29. And then I'm going to read the mystical interpretation of it from the Zohar. This is Genesis 29. Jacob set off briskly and headed toward the land of the people of the east. He came to a place where he saw a well in the field. 3 flocks of sheep were lying beside it. Since it was from this well that the flocks were watered, the top of the well was covered with a large stone. When all the flocks would come together there, the shepherds would roll the stone from the top of the well and water the sheep. Then they would replace the stone on the well. So now I'll read the story as the Zohar sees it, which gives us a more mystical interpretation rather than a literal interpretation of the story. So when it says that Jacob looked and beheld a well in the field, there is here an inner meaning to it, that he discerned the supernal well which corresponds to the well below. This is borne out by the next words, 3 flocks of sheep lying there by it. Since they were only 3, why is it written as such? And thither were all the flocks gathered. But in truth, the 3 allude to the south, the east, and the north. The south on one side, the north on the other, and the east between them. All 3 standing by that well, holding fast to it and filling it. Why all this? For out of that well they water the flocks. The allusion being the same as in the text, they give drink to all the hayot of the field. Further, the words, and thither were all the flocks gathered, can be illustrated from the passage, all the rivers run into the sea. And they rolled the stone from the well's mouth. They dispelled from it rigidity and hard judgment, which congeals it as it were into a stone, from which the water cannot flow. For when those rivers arise, the south, which is on the right, gathers strength and prevents the north from solidifying water. For a large river with great volume of water does not become frozen and congealed so soon as a small river with a small volume of water. Hence, when those rivers arise, the south, which is on the right, puts forth its strength, and the waters thaw and are loosened, so as to flow onward and give drinks to the flocks. They water the hayot of the field. Then they put the stone back upon the well's mouth in its place. So this sounds very odd and very strange, this description. But when we look at it in terms of our meditation, in terms of how this really happens, this transformation that takes place, it's very descriptive. But I do want to put out a caution before I start talking about those passages. And the caution is that when we do our hit boded meditation, our mindlessness meditation, we don't need to think about any of this. It just happens naturally. And we don't want to imagine it happening or conjure up some mood-making experience. We just want to meditate as we are instructed, surrender to the sound of the letter, and whatever happens, happens. However, when we're doing our hit bonen meditation and we're contemplating these things, it's good to look at it from the point of view of we are Jacob. When we close our eyes and we think of ourselves as facing east, which means to the right is the south and to the left is north, this is what's happening inside of us. So what we're actually saying is there's a rock, there's a stone that's blocking the well for the waters to run freely. What are these waters? These waters are the waters of pure consciousness. And why are the directions important? So when we think of this, we think of the waters of pure consciousness are like the unified field of pure consciousness in science. This is what's called in our tradition Ein Sof. There's no beginning, there's no end to it. It's pure consciousness that lies deep within us. It gives way to the cosmic sea. And this cosmic sea is what actually is the creative intelligence that we see all around us in creation. So when we talk about the directions in the Zohar, They relate to the finest relative field of existence. Ein Sof, pure consciousness, and the cosmic sea is not relative. It's without beginning and without end. It's infinite. But as creation begins to take place from pure consciousness, that relative sphere of existence comes into being. The finest relative at the very beginning of pure consciousness in the unified field is described in the Kabbalistic Semitic tradition as the Sephirot. The Sephirot have 3 columns. The center column is the first, Keter in the center column is the first emanation from the field of pure consciousness, Ein Sof, into the relative. So the center column, which faces east, which is within. So if we're imagining in our Hitbonen meditation, our contemplation, that we are as Jacob, our center, our pure consciousness is as we are facing east. This is just for the purpose of description. So to the right is south, to the left is north. So now if we look at the Zohar's description of the water flowing from the well, we can better understand how it relates practically to us and this transformation that I'm talking about. So from the center, from the crown, once the stone is pushed away, the waters flow freely. They flow to the south, as described in the Zohar. The right column, or as we're facing east, the south column, is the column that I would describe as the column of wisdom and mercy and compassion and kindness and love. Whereas the left side column, the north side column, is really the side of severity and understanding and judgment. So let's go back to, for a moment, how does this transformation take place within us? I described 2 ways: regular practice of meditation and kavanah, or the will for the change to take place. So what happens in our regular practice of meditation? This stone gets removed from the mouth of the well. How is the stone described in the Zohar? It's described in 2 ways. And we created the stone ourselves. It's described as rigidity and hard judgment. So by our own rigidity and by our own hard judgment, maybe from lifetimes, maybe from the time we were children, it's all built up and it's caused this stone to block those waters of pure consciousness from flowing freely within us. Meditation drills through that stone. That's why we're called well drillers in our tradition when we meditate. So the stone gets moved away from the mouth of the well. The waters of pure consciousness are allowed to flow. So what's being moved away? Rigidity and hard judgment is being moved away, which allows us to transform and be born anew. So what does this tell us? If we understand that from pure consciousness, the waters that flow into the relative sphere of existence flow through mercy and kindness and love and wisdom, and then they flow into the side, the north side, the side of severity and judgment. Severity and judgment become infused with mercy and compassion and love and kindness. So while judgment is necessary and severity is necessary to have balance in the world, what we find through our meditation and our willingness to change is that when we have judgment in our lives, it's the judgment that brings us to a higher state of consciousness is always infused with love. An example that was given to me by one of my teachers was, when you understand this with your children is when you really can understand the real meaning of the teaching. So every parent who sees their children, they're filled with love. But sometimes they must have some judgment and severity with the children. They never want to go to bed. They always want to stay up late and late and late. Most kids. Some kids want to go to bed. But most kids want to stay up. But you know they need their rest. So out of love you say, it's time for bed. I'm going to count to 10. You have to be in bed. But that severity and that judgment is just full of love. So this Zohar is telling us what really happens. If we meditate like Jacob and we understand that that rock, that stone is being pushed away, and then the pure consciousness flows, when we come out of our meditation into activity, both the south side and the north side and the center, the streams, the channels, those three columns have fast moving water. Even though the stone has been replaced, we're now in a higher state of consciousness. We have a transformation. Our judgment is infused with love, wisdom, and compassion. We're no longer rigid. And that rigidity, each time that stone is moved away, the stone gets less rigid and becomes more porous. And that gives us another rebirth and another rebirth and another rebirth. And all of these higher states of consciousness. And we can see how this happens in nature, and we can see how it happens in us. So it's a very practical thing. It's not a fanciful thing. And again, I don't want you in your Hitbo Dead mindlessness meditation to be making this happen. It'll just happen naturally. All we need to do is be willing and have the intention. The intention is important. We're not going to be rigid anymore. We're not going to have judgment that's not infused with those streams of kindness, compassion, and wisdom. And that's just a desire. Just like we have a desire to eat ice cream, we go and eat the ice cream. Happens naturally. We have a desire to be infused with wisdom and compassion in our judgment. It happens naturally. So when we do our meditation, just magically starts pushing that stone away from the mouth of the well. And then those waters fill us up. They fill us up through the right side and infuse the left side. And then each time we have an opportunity for transformation and a higher consciousness, we begin to see with new senses. We begin to smell with a new sense of smell. We begin to taste with a new sense of taste. And our experience is heightened. According to our tradition, this happens 32 times if we allow it to, and we are regular in our practice. And then on the 32nd time, the wave returns to the sea. And is a complete unification, complete unity consciousness. So I encourage you to ask me questions by email or call me. The email should be on the bottom of the screen at some point here. And I really thank you for taking the time to listen. And we'll have another newsletter in the next quarter. Thank you and shalom.